2,760 degrees Celsius. Sit with that number for a moment. Imagine you are traveling at 40,000 kilometers per hour. You are enclosed in a capsule the size of a small living room. Between you and the vacuum of space, a shell of metal and carbon and ceramic no thicker than the wall of your bedroom. And between you and death by fire, a layer of material called avcoat, bonded to the outside of your heat shield, ablating, burning away deliberately, so that you do not. This is not a hypothetical. This is not a simulation. On November 16th, 2022, the Orion spacecraft flew this exact re-entry profile during the uncrewed Artemis 1 mission. 9 minutes and 21 seconds of superheated plasma. 2,760 degrees Celsius at the shield face. Nearly half the surface temperature of the sun. And when NASA's engineers retrieved the capsule from the Pacific Ocean and began their post-flight inspection, they found something that had no place in any of their models. Something they had never seen before. 22 chunks of the avcoat heat shield had sheared away during re-entry. Not burned away, sheared away. And in 11 months, 4 human beings were scheduled to ride this same system around the moon and home again. The question is not whether NASA knew. The question is what they decided to do about it. Before we go further, you need to understand something. Not about rockets, not about astronauts, about physics. Because the thing that nearly killed the Artemis 2 crew isn't a design flaw in the conventional sense. It isn't a bolt tightened incorrectly, or a valve that failed, or a seal not rated for the cold. Those are human mistakes, and human mistakes can be traced, assigned, corrected. What happened to the Orion heat shield belongs to a different category of problem entirely. When a spacecraft re-enters Earth's atmosphere from deep space, not from low Earth orbit, but from the moon, it arrives at a fundamentally different speed than anything we routinely manage. The International Space Station re-enters at around 7.7 kilometers per second. Orion, returning from the moon, hits the atmosphere at approximately 11 kilometers per second. That difference sounds modest. It is not. Kinetic energy scales with the square of velocity. That means Orion's re-entry doesn't generate twice the heat of an ISS deorbit. It generates roughly twice the destructive energy density per unit of surface area. And all of that energy has to go somewhere. In the extreme heat of re-entry, the air in front of the capsule doesn't simply get hot, it ionizes. Individual electrons are stripped from their atoms. The gas transforms into a fourth state of matter, plasma, and it wraps around the spacecraft like a second skin made of fire. Radio signals cannot penetrate it. The crew goes silent. Mission control goes silent. For those 9 minutes and 21 seconds, the capsule is entirely alone. The solution to this problem is old, ancient in aerospace terms. It is called ablation. Instead of reflecting heat, instead of somehow insulating against it, which would require materials that do not yet exist, you sacrifice the shield itself. You design a material that chars, gasifies, and burns away in a controlled manner, carrying the thermal energy with it before it can conduct inward to the crew compartment. The shield dies slowly, so the crew does not die at all. NASA has been doing this since the Mercury program in the late 1950s. Apollo used it. Every crewed capsule ever built by America has used some version of it. The physics is well understood. The engineering is mature. That is exactly why what happened to Artemis I was so unsettling. The heat shield material chosen for Orion is called avcoat. It is not new. Avcoat was used on the Apollo command modules, the same basic formulation that brought Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins home from the moon on July 24th, 1969. NASA chose it deliberately, precisely because it was known, tested, trusted. But there was a difference, a significant one. For Apollo, avcoat was applied as a foam injected into a fiberglass honeycomb structure, bonded to the heat shield substrate. Each of approximately 370,000 individual cells was filled by hand, a labor-intensive process that NASA deemed too expensive and time-consuming for modern production. For Orion, engineers redesigned the manufacturing process. Instead of injecting avcoat into a honeycomb, They manufactured the material in large blocks, 180 blocks in total, each roughly the size and shape of a large floor tile, and bonded them directly to the shield's carbon fiber skin. It was faster, it was cheaper. It was, according to every model available at the time, equally effective. The models were wrong. To understand why, you need to understand something about the re-entry environment that is genuinely counterintuitive. During Orion's return from the moon, the capsule doesn't simply plunge straight down through the atmosphere and decelerate. It performs what engineers call a skip re-entry, a controlled, precisely calculated maneuver in which the capsule dips into the upper atmosphere, uses aerodynamic lift to partially exit again, and then re-enters on a second pass. This technique manages the heat load and the G-forces the crew experiences. It is the reason a crewed lunar return is survivable at all. But skip re-entry creates a thermal environment more complex than a simple ballistic plunge. The heat is not constant. The plasma flow changes. The boundary layer, the thin region of superheated gas immediately adjacent to the heat shield surface, behaves differently during the two re-entry phases than it does during a single continuous pass. Nobody fully understood before Artemis I what this would do to a block configuration AVCOAT heat shield over the full course of a lunar return. They found out on December 11th, 2022. When the Orion capsule was recovered from the Pacific Ocean and examined at NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, engineers noted immediate anomalies in the ablation pattern. Some areas of the shield had ablated more deeply than predicted, but more alarming than the depth was the geometry. In 22 locations across the shield, material had not simply burned away, it had separated. Clean-edged, geometric chunks of AVCOAT had detached from the substrate during the heat of re-entry and been carried away by the plasma flow. The chunks were not there to examine. They had been incinerated in the plasma stream, leaving behind concave voids in the shield surface, gaps where there should have been material. Windows, in a sense, though not windows you would want. NASA convened a formal investigation. The agency assigned its Engineering and Safety Center, the NESC, the same body that investigates shuttle accidents and mission-critical failures, to determine what had happened, whether it would happen again, and whether it was safe to put 4 human beings on the next flight. The answers they found were deeply uncomfortable. Here's the first thing the NESC determined. The separation was caused by a phenomenon called subsurface pyrolysis gas pressure. As the AVCOAT blocks heated from the outside, they ablated as designed, but simultaneously, gases generated by the decomposition of the material deeper within the block built up pressure inside the structure. In the Apollo honeycomb configuration, this gas had many small pathways to escape. In the Orion block configuration, the gas had fewer escape routes. In some locations, the pressure built until it overcame the bond between the AVCOAT block and the substrate, and the block, or a portion of it, simply blew off, like a blister, at 2,760 degrees Celsius, at 11 kilometers per second. The second thing the NESC determined was more troubling still. The phenomenon had been theoretically predicted, not by NASA's primary heat shield team, but in a 2020 internal engineering assessment that had been noted, filed, and not acted upon with sufficient urgency. The warning existed. It was in the system. And the third finding, the one that raises the question we will spend the next 40 minutes exploring in full, is this. After exhaustive analysis, NASA concluded that during Artemis I, the heat shield had retained sufficient integrity throughout re-entry. The crew compartment temperatures had remained within safe limits. The 22 void locations, while anomalous, had not caused a structural cascade. Had there been astronauts aboard, they would, in all probability, have survived. In all probability. That phrase. 2 words, carrying the weight of 4 lives. Because Artemis II is not an uncrewed test. Artemis II is Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Canadian astronaut Jeremy Hansen. 4 names. 4 human beings who will climb into that capsule, fly around the moon, and then spend 9 minutes and 21 seconds trusting that the heat shield between them and the fire holds together. And the question that should keep you awake, is not whether NASA is negligent. It is not whether the engineers are incompetent. The question is whether we have fully understood what went wrong. And the answer, as of the most recent NESC findings published in July 2024, is that we have not. Not entirely. Not yet. We have been here before. Not with this specific failure mode, not with this exact mechanism, but we have been to this place where a known system behaves unexpectedly, where the engineers run the models say it is fine, and the hardware disagrees in ways that cost lives. We have been here before, and we did not learn enough.
On January 28, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger broke apart 73 seconds after launch. The cause was a failed O-ring seal on the right solid rocket booster, a seal that stiffened in the cold overnight temperatures at Cape Canaveral, lost its resilience, and allowed superheated gas to escape and breach the external fuel tank. What the Rogers Commission found in its subsequent investigation was not a manufacturing defect. The O-rings worked correctly within their qualified temperature range. The failure was that NASA had launched at a temperature, 2.2 degrees Celsius at launch time, below that range, and had done so after an internal decision-making process that had suppressed concerns raised by Thiokol engineer Roger Boisjoly the evening before. Boisjoly had written an internal memo 7 months earlier, on July 31, 1985, explicitly warning that the O-ring erosion patterns he was seeing constituted a catastrophic risk. His memo used that exact word, catastrophic. It was filed. The launch went ahead. On February 1, 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated during re-entry. The cause was a piece of insulating foam, 0.77 kilograms of it, that had broken away from the external tank 81 seconds after launch and struck the leading edge of the left wing at approximately 870 kilometers per hour, breaching the reinforced carbon-carbon panels that protected the wing's interior structure from re-entry heat. 16 days later, when Columbia re-entered the atmosphere, superheated plasma entered that breach and destroyed the vehicle. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board found that NASA had known foam shedding was a recurring problem. It had occurred on multiple previous missions. The agency had reclassified it from a potential catastrophic risk to an acceptable in-flight anomaly. The phrase they used was accepted risk. Engineers at Boeing who raised concerns during the 16 days between launch and re-entry were not given the resources needed to fully assess the damage. Both disasters share a common DNA with what happened to the Orion heat shield in December 2022. Not the specific mechanism, not the specific failure. The common DNA is something subtler and more disturbing, the normalization of an anomaly that should not have been normalized. The migration of something that should have produced alarm into the category of understood risk. In the Artemis 1 post-flight investigation, NASA's NESC interviewed heat shield engineers and reviewed the decision trail leading to the block AVCOAT configuration. What they found was that the subsurface gas pressure issue, the blister mechanism, had been identified in pre-flight modeling as a low-probability concern. It had been assigned a risk level that did not require additional testing before the first uncrewed flight. The reasoning was circular in the way that aerospace risk reasoning sometimes becomes. We have not seen this failure in testing, therefore the probability is low, therefore the level of testing required does not need to be increased to observe the failure. The failure was observed on December 11, 2022, in the only test environment that mattered.
Dr. Sean Quinn, a materials engineer at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, was one of the investigators assigned to the Artemis I heat shield anomaly review. In a presentation to the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics in January 2024, Quinn described the failure as a multi-physics coupling problem that our standard modeling tools were not architected to capture. What he meant, translated from engineering language into plain speech, is this: the interaction between the ablation chemistry, the internal gas pressure dynamics, and the mechanical stress state of the block under aerodynamic loading was too complex a combination for the models in use to simulate accurately. Each individual phenomenon was understood. Their interaction under the precise conditions of a lunar return skip re-entry was not. This is not a reassuring finding. This is a finding that should produce specific directed fear. Because if the models couldn't capture the interaction that caused 22 chunks to shear off the Artemis I shield, the question immediately and urgently becomes, what other interactions are the models not capturing? Let us be precise about what the Artemis I heat shield investigation actually found. Because precision is the only honest response to a problem of this magnitude. The Orion heat shield is 5.03 meters in diameter, the largest heat shield ever flown on a crewed spacecraft. It is not a flat disk. It is a blunt body, a shallow cone, designed so that the capsule presents its maximum surface area to the oncoming plasma flow and creates a strong bow shock that keeps the hottest plasma away from the structure. The center of the shield, called the stagnation point, faces directly into the plasma stream and experiences the highest heat flux. The edges experience different, more complex aerodynamic conditions. The avcoat blocks are not all identical. They were manufactured in 72 different geometric shapes to conform to the curved surface of the shield. Total avcoat mass on the Artemis I flight was approximately 726 kilograms. After re-entry, post-flight inspection measured ablation depths ranging from 7 millimeters at the shield's edge to approximately 38 millimeters near the stagnation zone. These numbers were within the predicted range. The 22 voids were not within the predicted range. The largest single void measured approximately 100 square centimeters in plan area, roughly the size of an open human hand. The depth of the void, measured from the original surface to the exposed substrate, varied by location. In the deepest case, the void penetrated to within 8 millimeters of the carbon fiber heat shield structure beneath the avcoat layer. 8 millimeters. To understand what that means, you need to know what lies beneath the avcoat. The carbon fiber composite heat shield structure is not itself a thermal protection system. It is a structural component, strong, but not rated for prolonged direct plasma exposure. If plasma had entered a void of sufficient depth and area during re-entry, the scenario engineer's model is this: localized heating of the carbon fiber structure, potential structural degradation, possible breach of the pressure vessel behind it. The crew compartment is behind the pressure vessel. The NESC analysis concluded that during Artemis I, the void geometries were insufficient to cause a thermal breach at the carbon fiber layer, given the specific re-entry trajectory and heating rates of that particular mission. The margins were real, if uncomfortable. There were millimeters of safety between what happened and what could have happened. But here is the element of this analysis that is almost never discussed in the coverage of the heat shield anomaly. The Artemis I re-entry was not a nominal Artemis II re-entry. The Artemis I capsule carried no crew, and therefore no life support consumables. No crew equipment, no personal gear. It was lighter than a crewed Orion capsule. The re-entry trajectory, the precise angle, the skip profile, the heating rate as a function of time was calibrated for the Artemis I mass properties. Artemis II will be heavier. The re-entry trajectory will be slightly different. The heating rate distribution across the heat shield will be slightly different. Slightly different in re-entry physics is not a phrase that should provide comfort. In a system where 8 millimeters of avcoat separated the crew from potential structural breach, slightly different thermal loading distributions are not a rounding error. NASA's Thermal Protection System team, led at Johnson Space Center by Dr. Joseph Olejniczak, completed a detailed computational fluid dynamics analysis in early 2024 to assess how the Artemis II re-entry environment would differ from Artemis I. That analysis confirmed that heating rates at the shield periphery, the region where most of the anomalous voids were observed, would be between 4% and 7% higher for the crewed mission than for the uncrewed test, due to the mass difference, 4 to 7%, on a system that was already pushing its design margins. In the immediate aftermath of the Artemis I heat shield investigation, NASA had, in principle, 3 options. Option 1, redesign the heat shield, return to the Apollo-era honeycomb avcoat approach, or develop an entirely new block geometry that provided better gas venting pathways. This would have been the most conservative choice. It would also have delayed Artemis II by a minimum of 3 to 4 years. According to internal NASA schedule assessments, reviewed by the Government Accountability Office in its March 2024 report on Artemis program risks. Option 2. Conduct additional ground testing to better characterize the blister mechanism and establish updated design margins with higher confidence. This is what the NESC formally recommended in its initial findings. NASA's Arc Jet Complex at Ames Research Center in California, one of the few facilities in the world capable of simulating re-entry plasma environments, was identified as the primary test location. Option 3. Accept the findings, implement targeted manufacturing improvements to the block bonding process, update the thermal models with the new understanding of the gas pressure mechanism, and proceed with Artemis II on a modified schedule. NASA chose a combination of options 2 and 3, with an emphasis on 3. The Arc Jet testing program was initiated in 2023. AVCOAT block samples were exposed to simulated re-entry heating environments at Ames, and the results did provide new data on the conditions under which block separation occurred. Engineers established that the separation was strongly dependent on the rate of temperature increase, the thermal ramp rate, in the subsurface layers. If the ramp rate was controlled below a certain threshold, block separation could be suppressed. The problem is that you cannot control the thermal ramp rate during re-entry. The plasma environment is determined by the atmosphere, the capsule's speed, and its trajectory. You cannot negotiate with physics. What the ArcJet data did allow was a refined computational model that could predict with greater accuracy which specific block locations on the Artemis II shield were at highest risk of separation, and by how much the manufacturing process needed to be improved to reduce that risk. NASA implemented changes to the block bonding adhesive formulation and the surface preparation process. Independent quality inspections of each block were added to the production sequence. In its December 2023 Mission Readiness Assessment, NASA's Human Exploration and Operations Mission Directorate concluded that the updated heat shield configuration for Artemis II was acceptable for crewed flight with residual risk within established program limits. Residual risk within. Established program limits. This is bureaucratic language, and you need to sit with what it actually means. It does not mean the risk is zero. It does not mean another void event is impossible. It means that NASA's Risk Acceptance Framework, the formal documented system by which the agency decides what level of danger is acceptable for a crewed mission, has been applied, and the residual probability of a catastrophic heat shield failure has been assigned a number, and that number falls below the agency's stated threshold for proceeding. That threshold, for context, is a statistical concept called loss of crew probability, or LOC. NASA's current design requirement for the Orion spacecraft is a LOC probability of no greater than 1 in 270 for any single mission. The agency does not publish its post-anomaly LOC assessment for the Artemis II heat shield configuration, because such assessments are classified at the program level. But the Government Accountability Office, in its March 2024 report, noted that several Artemis II risk line items, including the heat shield, were being carried at residual risk levels higher than desired by the program's own internal safety board. Higher than desired by the safety board of the program itself. Here's the thing that is most difficult to understand about the Artemis II heat shield situation, and the thing that this documentary is really about. It is not the technical problem. Technical problems are solvable. They are being worked on. The engineers at NASA are not careless or indifferent. The people working this problem are some of the most capable thermal engineers on the planet, and they are genuinely trying to ensure that Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen come home safely. The thing that is most difficult to understand is the silence.
The Artemis I heat shield anomaly was publicly disclosed by NASA Administrator Bill Nelson at a press conference on August 23, 2023. 8 months after the Artemis I splashdown. The disclosure described unexpected material loss from the heat shield. It confirmed that an investigation was underway. It did not, at that press conference, convey the depth or the potential severity of what had been found. The phrase 22 locations of material separation did not appear in NASA's public communications until a more detailed technical briefing in November 2023. Major mainstream media coverage of the heat shield anomaly was sparse. The story appeared in specialist aerospace publications, Ars Technica, Aviation Week, Spaceflight Now, and was covered in some detail by science journalists who follow NASA closely. It did not achieve significant public attention. It did not produce the kind of scrutiny that a finding of this nature arguably warranted. Part of the reason is structural. NASA's technical briefings are dense and require background knowledge to interpret. The agency's communications are carefully worded in ways that accurately describe the situation without conveying its emotional weight. Residual risk within established program limits is a true statement. It is also a statement designed to end conversations rather than begin them. Part of the reason is the complexity of the problem itself. The heat shield story has no villain. There is no individual who made a clearly wrong decision. There is a sequence of individually defensible engineering choices that, in combination, produced an outcome nobody predicted. That kind of systemic risk is genuinely harder to communicate than a simple failure. And part of the reason, it must be said, is that NASA, the US government, the Artemis program's political supporters, and the international partners who have committed billions of dollars and decades of work to this program all have strong institutional interests in Artemis 2 proceeding on schedule. The program has already slipped significantly. The original Artemis 2 target date of May 2024 was pushed to September 2025, then to April 2026. Further delays that would result from a decision to replace or fundamentally redesign the heat shield, would be enormously costly in money, in political capital, and in the credibility of the entire program. This does not mean the decision to proceed with Artemis 2 is wrong. It may well be the right decision. The residual risk may genuinely be acceptable. The engineering improvements may be sufficient, but the public, the people whose tax dollars fund this program, and whose relationship to the cosmos it is intended to deepen, deserve to understand clearly what that decision involves. They deserve to know that 4 people are going to ride around the moon inside a spacecraft whose heat shield has a documented, incompletely understood failure mode, and that the probability of that failure mode causing a catastrophic outcome during the crewed mission has been assessed and found acceptable by the same organization that is responsible for the mission's success. That is not a scandal. It may not even be a mistake. It is, however, a fact. And facts about people risking their lives in service of human exploration are facts that deserve to be told clearly, without softening, and without silence.
Reed Wiseman is a former U.S. Navy test pilot. He has a master's degree in systems engineering from Johns Hopkins University. He flew to the International Space Station in 2014 on a Soyuz spacecraft and spent 165 days in orbit. He became NASA's chief astronaut in 2020. He knows, with the precision of a man trained to quantify risk in the cockpit of experimental aircraft, exactly what residual risk within established program limits means. Victor Glover is a U.S. Navy commander and former FA-18 pilot. He holds a master's degree in flight test engineering from the Air Force Institute of Technology and a further master's in systems engineering from the Naval Postgraduate School. He flew to the ISS in November 2020 on the first operational Crew Dragon mission and spent 168 days aboard the station. He is the first Black astronaut to be assigned as a primary crew member on a lunar mission. Christina Koch spent 328 consecutive days aboard the ISS on her first mission, setting the record for the longest spaceflight by a woman. She holds a master's degree in electrical engineering from North Carolina State University. She is a former Antarctic researcher who spent months at the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station. She is one of the most experienced astronauts in the current NASA Corps. Jeremy Hansen is a colonel in the Canadian Armed Forces, a CF-18 pilot, and the first Canadian to be assigned to a lunar mission. He has not yet flown in space. Artemis 2 will be his first spaceflight, a detail that adds a layer of specific weight to every risk consideration. These are not abstractions. These are human beings with biographies and families and the full weight of individual consciousness. Jeremy Hansen has a wife and 3 children. Christina Koch is engaged. Victor Glover has 4 daughters. They know about the heat shield. They have been briefed in detail. They have access to the NESC findings. They are, in the language of informed consent, aware of the risks they are accepting, and they are going anyway. This is worth understanding, not as heroism, though it is heroic, but as information about the nature of exploration itself. Every meaningful journey into unknown territory involves accepting risks that cannot be fully quantified. Every navigator who ever crossed an uncharted ocean accepted a residual risk within the limits of what their vessel could be known to survive. Wiseman, Glover, Koch, and Hansen are doing something that human beings have always done and always will do, pressing forward against incomplete knowledge with the best tools available towards something that matters. The question for the rest of us, for the people watching from the ground, is whether we are honest with ourselves about what that means. But we need to go further, because the Artemis II heat shield is not, in the largest sense, the story. It is a window into a story. And the story it opens onto is one that applies not just to Orion, not just to NASA, but to every human spacecraft that will ever carry people beyond the protective envelope of low Earth orbit. Re-entry from deep space is categorically different from re-entry from the ISS or from the space shuttle's orbital altitude. And as humanity prepares, genuinely prepares this time, after 50 years of false starts and canceled programs, to send human beings to Mars, the re-entry problem does not get easier. It gets harder. A crewed spacecraft returning from Mars will arrive at Earth at a velocity between 12 and 14 kilometers per second, faster than Orion returns from the Moon. The heat load will be higher. The re-entry duration will be longer. The thermal protection system will need to be larger, heavier, and more robust than anything yet built. And here is the terrifying mathematical reality of the situation. We do not currently have a heat shield material that is definitively capable of protecting a crewed Mars return vehicle. Avcoat works for lunar return. Its performance envelope, now better understood, after Artemis I covers that mission. But Avcoat, in its current form, does not scale cleanly to Mars return velocities. The ablation rates at 14 kilometers per second produce a different pyrolysis chemistry, different gas pressure dynamics, different mechanical loading. NASA's Materials Research Division at Ames Research Center has been developing next-generation ablative materials for over a decade. The most promising candidate family is called pica, phenolic impregnated carbon ablator. Pica was used on the SpaceX Dragon capsule's heat shield and performed well in low Earth orbit reentry. A variant called Pica X, developed by SpaceX's materials team, has been used on every Dragon mission since 2010 without a significant anomaly. But Pica and Pica X have not been tested at Mars return velocities. They have been modeled. The models suggest they would perform adequately. We know from Artemis I what models that suggest adequate performance are sometimes worth. Dr. Ethiraj Venkatapathy, the chief architect of the Pica development program at Ames, stated in a 2023 interview with the journal Acta Astronautica that the current materials research program is approximately 15 years behind where it needs to be to support a crewed Mars mission in the 2040 timeframe that NASA and international partners have publicly discussed. He described the gap not as a materials science gap, the physics of ablation is well understood, but as a testing infrastructure gap. The facilities needed to fully characterize next-generation heat shield materials at Mars. Return velocities simply do not currently exist. The most powerful arc jet facilities in the world, the facilities at NASA Ames, at the Air Force's Arnold Engineering Development Complex in Tennessee, and at the European Space Agency's Skyroxoco plasma wind tunnel in Italy. You cannot fully replicate the combined heat flux, pressure, and velocity environment of a Mars atmospheric entry at crewed vehicle scale. We have committed, as a species, to sending human beings to Mars. We have accepted this as a goal, a destination, an expression of our nature as an exploring species. And we are doing so without yet possessing the tools to fully test whether the material we will use to bring those people home can do the job. This is not a reason to stop. It may not even be a reason to slow down. The history of exploration is a history of proceeding in advance of complete knowledge. And the history of aerospace engineering is a history of building the tools to answer questions that the mission itself first raised. The heat shield problem is solvable. It will be solved. But it will not be solved by pretending it is smaller than it is. And it will not be solved by the kind of institutional normalization of risk that produced the Challenger and Columbia disasters. It will be solved by the combination of honesty, resources, and sustained institutional will that has historically been in shortest supply precisely when it is most needed. Let us come back to the number, 2,760 degrees Celsius. That is the temperature the Orion heat shield faces at its peak heating moment. That is the environment in which 22 chunks of material separated from the surface and were carried away in the plasma stream. That is the environment in which 8 millimeters of material stood between the carbon fiber substrate and potential structural breach. But we have been telling this story at human scale, and the full weight of it requires us to briefly change scale entirely. The atmosphere that makes re-entry dangerous, the atmosphere that ionizes into plasma at the speeds required to return from the moon, is also the atmosphere that makes life on Earth possible. It is the same thin layer of gas that blocks the ultraviolet radiation that would otherwise sterilize the surface of our planet. It is the same thin layer that produces the weather systems that distribute fresh water across the continents. It is the same thin layer that, when you look at Earth from space, appears as the most heartbreakingly fragile blue line along the planet's edge. A membrane, measured against the scale of the solar system, thinner in proportion to Earth's diameter than the skin of an apple is to the apple itself. From 400 kilometers altitude, the height of the International Space Station, the atmosphere is invisible. Not thin, invisible. A layer of gas so shallow against the curve of the planet that orbital mechanics barely register its existence until a spacecraft attempts to use it to slow down. That is what we are working with. That is the engineering medium for one of the most demanding problems in human spaceflight. A layer of gas so thin it is invisible from low orbit, which we must use as a braking mechanism at 11 kilometers per second, which transforms into plasma at those speeds, which reaches 2,760 degrees Celsius, and which we must navigate through in a capsule carrying human beings, guided by a layer of sacrificial carbon foam bonded to a carbon fiber shell. And we have been doing this since 1961, and we have been doing it well enough that the vast majority of crewed re-entries in history have succeeded. And we have also lost 14 people in spaceflight accidents, not during re-entry from deep space, but in the Columbia disaster during re-entry from low orbit, and in the Challenger disaster during launch. In both cases, the failure mode was one that had been identified, assigned a risk level, and normalized. 14 names. 14 people who went to work one morning as astronauts and did not come home. The Artemis II crew could come home. The probability is high. The engineering work done in response to the Artemis I anomaly is real, and it is serious, and it has improved the system. The residual risk, whatever specific number NASA's safety board has calculated, is almost certainly well below the 1 in 270 program limit. But the margin between almost certainly and certainly is where the 14 names live. It is where Roger Boisley's memo lives, filed and unacted upon. It is where the Boeing engineers' concerns about Columbia's foam damage live, dismissed during those 16 days. It is the gap between the model and the hardware, between prediction and reality, between the simulation and the 9 minutes of silence. And it is also, let us be clear about this, where courage lives. Because Reed Wiseman knows about the gap. Victor Glover knows. Christina Koch knows. Jeremy Hansen knows. They have read the NSC reports. They have sat in briefings where the word residual was used. They have made a fully informed decision to accept those odds in service of something they believe is worth accepting them for. The question you must ask yourself, and it is genuinely a question, not a rhetorical device, is what you think about that. Whether you believe the risk is acceptable, whether you believe the program's communication about that risk has been adequate, whether the knowledge that 4 specific human beings with families and careers and futures are riding a system with a documented, incompletely understood anomaly changes how you think about the value of lunar exploration, the responsibility of space agencies to the public, and the relationship between human aspiration and human safety. There is no clean answer. There never is, at the edge of human capability. The Apollo 1 fire killed Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee on January 27, 1967, in a pure oxygen capsule atmosphere that engineers had raised concerns about and been overruled. Their deaths produced safety reforms that made the moon landing possible. Their deaths were not meaningless, but the question of whether they were preventable, whether the risk was properly assessed and properly communicated, is one that the aerospace community has never fully resolved. We are in a similar moment now, not because the Artemis 2 heat shield will necessarily fail. It probably will not fail. But because the process by which we assess, communicate, and accept the risk that it might fail is a process that will define every deep space mission that follows. Mars is 40 years away, or 20, or 10, depending on who you believe and how much you trust their funding models. The heat shield problem for Mars is larger than the heat shield problem for the Moon. If we normalize the Artemis 2 risk without fully understanding it, we carry that normalization forward into a mission environment where the margins are even thinner and the consequences even less recoverable. There is no rescue mission from Mars. When a crewed Mars vehicle hits the Earth's atmosphere at 14 kilometers per second, after a 7-month transit from the Red Planet, there are no options, no abort modes, no rescue corridor. The thermal protection system works, or the crew does not come home. There is no 1/8 millimeter of margin. There is no arc jet test that can fully replicate the environment. There is only the material, the plasma, and the 9 minutes of silence, stretched, in the Mars case, to something closer to 15. The Artemis 2 heat shield anomaly is a warning, not about Avcoat specifically, or about block versus honeycomb construction, or about a specific manufacturing process that has since been improved. It is a warning about the structure of knowledge at the frontier, about the gap between models and reality, about the institutional dynamics that determine whether warnings become action or become filed memos. It is a warning that we have received before. We received it in January 1986. We received it again in February 2003. We are receiving it now in the post-flight inspection photographs of 22 voids in a heat shield recovered from the Pacific Ocean, in the language of residual risk and established program limits. The question, the only question that matters, when the last piece of this story is laid out, is whether we are listening this time. The Pacific Ocean is 14,000 kilometers wide, at its broadest point. At 3:40 in the morning on December 11th, 2022, the Orion capsule hit the water 93 kilometers off the coast of Baja California, Mexico, close enough to the recovery ship USS Portland that the pararescue teams were in the water within minutes. The capsule had completed its mission, it had gone around the moon and come home. It had survived 2,760 degrees Celsius, and floating in the pre-dawn Pacific, scorched and ablated and flawed in 22 specific locations, it was the most capable crewed re-entry vehicle ever built. Larger than Apollo, more sophisticated than anything that came before, the product of decades of work by thousands of engineers across dozens of institutions and partner nations. This is both things at once. The heat shield is a problem and an achievement. The gap is real, and the capability is real. The risk is present, and the mission is worth it. The universe does not offer clean choices. The history of exploration does not offer clean choices. The only honest position is to hold all of it simultaneously, the 22 voids and the 5.03 meter diameter, the 8 millimeters of margin and the 40 years of ablative science, the residual risk and the 4 names on the crew manifest. We are going back to the moon. We are, eventually, going to Mars. We will build better heat shields. We will develop the test infrastructure to qualify them properly. We will close the gap between the models and the hardware, not completely and not permanently, but enough to proceed. We will proceed because that is what we do. We will proceed because the 4 people who have volunteered to ride that capsule around the moon understand, with the full weight of their training and experience, what they are accepting. And because the alternative, to stop, to retreat, to decide that the margins are too thin and the knowledge too incomplete, is not actually an alternative. Not for us. Not for a species that has been pointed at the horizon since before we had words for it. But we owe the people making the journey our full honesty. We owe them our attention. We owe them the willingness to look at the photographs of those 22 voids and feel the appropriate weight of what they represent. Not fear, not paralysis. Just honesty. Just. We know this, and we are watching, and we will not look away.